Eddie Willers, special assistant to the vice president of Taggart Transcontinental, walks toward his New York office. An anonymous homeless man asks, "Who is John Galt?" After Eddie gives him some money. Eddie is disturbed by the phrase, a slang reference to all that is hopeless and unknowable. As he looks around, he sees businesses failing everywhere. He remembers an oak tree he saw destroyed by lightning as a child. Eddie meets with the railroad's president, James "Jim" Taggart, about another wreck on the Rio Norte line. He argues that the track must be replaced, but Taggart says he cannot do anything until the new track arrives from Orrin Boyle's Associated Steel. Eddie wants to use Reardon Steel, but Jim reminds him that Boyle is a good friend and deserves a break. Eddie counters that they risk losing every major shipper in Colorado to the Phoenix-Durango, a rapidly growing young railroad run by Dan Conway. They have already lost the support of Ellis Wyatt, an entrepreneur who has found a way to revive exhausted oil wells. Wyatt Oil switched to the Phoenix-Durango when Taggart could not keep up with its shipments. Jim tells Eddie that nothing can be done. After a trip to examine the Rio Norte line, Dagny Taggart, Eddie's boss and Jim's sister, sits aboard a train, listening to the notes of a fantastic symphony. It turns out to be just a brakeman whistling. He tells her the tune is Richard Halley's Fifth Concerto. When she tells him that is impossible, since Halley only wrote 4 concertos, he becomes evasive. Later, Dagny awakes to find the train has stopped. When she investigates, she finds the engineer refuses to take responsibility for moving the train ahead. She identifies herself and orders him to move the train. Seeing how hard it is to find good men, she makes a note to herself to promote a talented employee named Owen Kellogg. At a meeting with her brother Jim, Dagny tells him that the problems with the Rio Norte are worse than they thought, so she has cancelled the order with Orrin Boyle and placed an order with Reardon Steel for a new alloy called Reardon Metal. Jim complains that she had no authority from the board and that they should give Boyle a chance as a little guy up against the larger Reardon Steel. He denounces her choice of Reardon Metal, an unproven new material that no one has been willing to try. Dagny does not care what the others are doing. She knows that Reardon Metal is the best substance on the market. Jim evades the issue, but finally agrees to put the order through. Dagny calls the music publishing company to inquire about Halley's Fifth Concerto, but is told that Halley has dropped out of public life and has not published anything in 8 years. Owen Kellogg comes to see Dagny. Before she can offer him a promotion, he informs her that he is quitting. She tries to discover his reason, but he seems to have none. She offers him anything he wants to stay, but he refuses. If he loves his job, she asks, why leave? He shrugs and answers, "Who is John Galt?" Hank Reardon watches happily as the first heat for the first order of Reardon Metal is poured. As he walks home, he thinks of the 10 years of trial and effort that yielded the new alloy and of his early years of hard work in the mines and his steady rise to ownership of mines and mills. Arriving home, he finds his wife talking to his mother, his brother Philip, and Paul Larkin, an unsuccessful businessman and old friend. He apologizes for being late but finds that he cannot tell them about Reardon Metal, knowing they will not share his joy. His family insults him and his devotion to his work, scolding him for working so much and not caring about them. He presents his wife Lillian with a bracelet, a chain poured from the first order of Reardon Metal. His mother reprimands him for thinking that his metal should be like diamonds to his wife. Reardon feels only an incredible sense of exhaustion and confusion over what his family wants from him. Although he supports them, they seem to want to hold some claim over him. They profess love for him, but despise all the qualities in him that he feels are worthy of love. Paul Larkin approaches Reardon and advises him to ease up on his individualism. He reminds Reardon that he should pay attention to his men in Washington. Reardon knows that every day it becomes more important to have a strong lobbyist in protection against the legislature, but he cannot bring himself to think about it with any conviction. In these early chapters, Rand clearly establishes the state of the nation. Decay is rampant and unavoidable. Businesses are failing, and companies that remain in business face shortages and delays. People respond with a helpless sense of doom, epitomized in the rhetorical question, "Who is John Galt?" The question represents a melancholy shrug, a declaration of defenselessness before a force too terrifying and massive to combat or even comprehend, a pervasive hopelessness and loss of spirit. The oak tree that Eddie remembers serves as an apt metaphor for society's decay. Eddie recalls that after lightning struck the tree, he looked inside to see that it was already dead, and the trunk had been a mere shell all along. Similarly, society has begun to decay from the inside out. In the dark bar, four men discuss the state of the nation's economy. Orrin Boyle argues that Reardon Steel has an unfair advantage because it owns iron mines, while his Associated Steel does not. Jim Taggart agrees to use his influence in Washington to force Reardon to give up the mines. Paul Larkin, also at the meeting, agrees to receive the mines from Reardon but give the ore directly to Boyle. In return, Jim wants Boyle to convince friends on the National Alliance of Railroads to force Dan Conway out of Colorado on the grounds that his Phoenix-Durango line offers cutthroat competition to Taggart in a state where Taggart had operations first. Wesley Mouch, Reardon's Washington man, is also present. In return for Mouch's not warning Reardon, Jim agrees to find him a bureaucratic post in Washington. Their conversation shifts to Mexico, where Jim has built the San Sebastian line. There are rumors that Mexico is going to nationalize the line, but Boyle refutes them. He tells Jim that on a recent visit, he rode in old, run-down trains. Back at the office, Jim confronts Dagny about the shoddy trains. She tells him she has removed everything of value from the San Sebastian line to minimize Taggart's losses if Mexico nationalizes the line. They argue about the San Sebastian line, the first major project Jim began after becoming president of Taggart, and one Dagny has opposed from the beginning, believing the resources were needed on the Rio Norte line. Jim reminds her that Mexico has guaranteed their property rights for 200 years and argues that he built it for the good of the Mexican people. But he also built the line in order to reap a huge profit from the nearby Donconia copper mines. Dagny reminds him that Francisco Donconia, formerly an industrial genius, has become a worthless playboy in recent years and has yet to produce any copper from the mines. Eddie Willers enters the cafeteria of the Taggart terminal. He sits, as he often does, with a grease-stained worker. Eddie has always liked this worker and feels comfortable with him, although he does not know his name. Eddie complains about the decay slowly eating the world in the railroad. He has hope, however, because Dagny has found a reliable contractor and is going to fix the Rio Norte line. The worker inquires about Dagny's personal life, and Eddie tells him what he knows. He is surprised by the worker's interest. Eddie informs Dagny that McNamara, their new contractor, has just quit, offering no reasons. No one knows where he has gone. The People's State of Mexico nationalizes the San Sebastian Railroad and the Donconia copper mines. In his report to the board of directors, Jim takes full credit for Dagny's decision to remove the most valuable equipment from Mexico before the San Sebastian Railroad was nationalized. The members of the National Alliance of Railroads approve a proposal known as the anti-dog-eat-dog rule, designed to reduce competition among railroads. According to the proposal, the interests of the whole industry are to be determined by majority vote, and each company must subordinate itself to the majority's decision. Dagny goes to see Dan Conway, president of the Phoenix-Durango Railroad, which will cease to exist under the new rule. She urges him to fight, but he is too tired and has decided to retire. Dagny had intended to compete with him in Colorado, but she cannot stand to defeat him in this fashion. She feels like a loser. He tells her to get her Rio Norte line up and running quickly, because the fate of Ellis Wyatt depends on it. Ellis Wyatt comes to see Dagny and tells her angrily that she must fix the Rio Norte line at once. He issues her an ultimatum. If she does not give him the transportation he needs, he will take her company down with him. She tells him that he will have the transportation he needs in time. He is surprised, having expected excuses and evasion. Dagny goes to see Hank Reardon. She tells him about the Wyatt meeting and tells him they must rebuild the line in 9 months, not 12. He assures her that he will be able to provide what she needs. Reardon is surprised and delighted that she deals with him on his own level and thinks he has finally met a woman he can understand. He tells her that it is people like them who move the world and who will ultimately pull it through. After a night of passionate lovemaking, Dagny and Reardon wake together. Reardon is angry and disgusted. He sees sex as a base and obscene impulse and believes both Dagny and he worthy of contempt. Dagny laughs in disagreement. She is proud to make love to him and share her desire with someone she respects. She tells him she makes no claims on him except that he come to her with his lowest physical desires. Jim meets Cheryl Brooks, a young, poor shopgirl who recognizes him from the newspapers. She thinks he is responsible for the success of the John Galt line, and he allows her to believe it. Cheryl worships heroes and their accomplishments, and Jim enjoys the attention. He invites her to his apartment for a drink. She finds some of his comments odd, especially his contempt for Hank Reardon, whom she believes is a great man, but she is thrilled to be with him. Dagny and Reardon go away for a vacation together, driving around the countryside. Hoping to locate some scarce machine tools, they stop at the site of the 20th Century Motor Company manufacturing plant. They are shocked to find the plant not just closed, but ruined, and the town it supported in abject poverty. Inside the plant slab they find the remnants of a motor designed to run on static electricity. Its existence would revolutionize industrial production. They are determined to find the inventor and rebuild it. Wesley Mouch, recently promoted to top coordinator of the Bureau of Economic Planning and National Resources, issues a number of statements urging the use of emergency powers to balance the economy. The Union of Locomotive Engineers demands that the maximum speed of all trains be reduced to 60 miles an hour. The Union of Railway Conductors and Brakemen demands that the length of all freight trains be reduced to 60 cars. The states of Wyoming, New Mexico, Utah, and Arizona demand that the number of trains run in Colorado not exceed the number running in each of these neighboring states. A group headed by Aaron Boyle demands the passage of a law limiting the production of Reardon metal to an amount equal to the output of any other steel mill of equal capacity. Another group demands a law giving every customer who wants it an equal supply of Reardon metal. Still another group seeks to prevent Easton businesses from moving out of state, hoping to stop the trend of businesses relocating to Colorado. Reardon finds that Paul Larkin did not deliver his supply of ore. He sent it to Warren Boyle instead, as a term of the deal arranged earlier by Jim Taggart. After this, Reardon begins to obtain ore through shady illegal deals, the only option left to him. Dagny's search for the motor's inventor leads her to Lee Hunsaker. He tells her that he purchased the factory from the heirs of Jed Starnes. He had asked Midas Mulligan, the richest man in the country, for a loan, but Mulligan had refused him. When Mulligan refused, Hunsaker filed suit against him. The judge in charge, Judge Narragansett, ruled for Mulligan, but Hunsaker appealed. A higher court ordered Mulligan to issue the loan based solely on Hunsaker's need and despite his lack of ability or collateral. Instead of paying, Mulligan disappeared without a trace. Narragansett disappeared a few months later. When Dagny locates Starnes' heirs, she discovers why the company fell apart. It had been run according to a radical plan in which workers were paid based only on their proclaimed needs, and those who worked hardest were required to support those who did not. The resulting chaos destroyed the company. Dagny finds the wife of William Hastings, the former chief engineer. She sends Dagny to find a man who she thinks would know the name of the inventor. Dagny finds him working as a cook in a Wyoming diner. He does know the inventor, but he will not give the name. Dagny is shocked to learn the cook is Hugh Exton, a famous philosopher who retired years ago. He gives her a mysterious cigarette stamped with the sign of the dollar. When Dagny returns to New York, she finds that every law the looters were seeking has been passed. A special tax has been imposed on the state of Colorado. Dagny tries to reach the defiant Ellis Wyatt, but when she gets to Colorado, she sees that he has set fire to his oil fields and disappeared. The reconstruction of the Rio Norte line is plagued with problems, But Dagny and Reardon manage to keep the project on schedule through quick and decisive actions. Ellis Wyatt appears at the Rio Nord construction site, where he has been helping out behind the scenes. His appreciative tone with Dagny acknowledges that she is as driven and focused as he is. Dagny is relieved to also find Reardon at the site. He proposes replacing an old bridge in Colorado with one made entirely of Reardon metal. Dagny approves his bold plan. Back in New York, Dagny orders a cup of coffee at a diner. A man sitting next to her complains that there is no human spirit, that men are concerned only with satisfying their body's needs. Another man shrugs off the importance of morality. "Who is John Galt?" he says with a sneer. At this, a small, shriveled tramp declares that he knows. John Galt was a great explorer who found the Fountain of Youth. Dr. Potter, from the State Science Institute, comes to see Reardon and tells him that society is not ready for Reardon metal. He says that Reardon's company might harm his competitors by producing too much and asks Reardon to wait a few years before producing his metal. When Reardon refuses, Potter offers to buy all rights to his metal, at any price. Reardon refuses. Potter tells him that there are certain bills pending in the legislature that make businessmen particularly vulnerable. The threat is clear. Later, the State Science Institute issues a formal warning about Reardon metal. The statement lacks any scientific basis but hints at possible dangers. In response to the denunciation, Taggart stock crashes. Ben Neely, the Taggart contractor, quits. The Brotherhood of Road and Track Workers forbids its members to work with the metal. And Jim leaves town. Visiting the State Science Institute in New Hampshire, Dagny finds that Dr. Stadler, at one time the greatest scientist in the country, is completely disillusioned. He agrees that the metal is a great discovery but says the Institute will not support it. Despite spending millions, the Institute's metallurgists have failed to discover anything as valuable, and they are afraid to draw attention to the fact that a private citizen succeeded where a government-funded institution failed. When Dagny finds Jim, he is desperate. He wants to save the railroad but has no idea what to do. Dagny tells him she will finish the line on her own. Because everyone is afraid of Reardon metal, she will resign and start her own company. After she proves that the metal works, she will return to Taggart and bring her line with her. She will name her company the John Galt Line. Dagny goes to Francisco d'Anconia for money, but he refuses to help and expresses shock at her name for the line. Dagny finds the investors she needs among the industrialists of Colorado. Reardon also invests. The legislature passes the Equalization of Opportunity Bill, which will force Reardon to give up his mines. Wesley Mouch had not informed Reardon that the bill was being considered, and he cannot be reached by phone. The Mexican government has discovered, upon nationalizing Francisco d'Anconia's San Sebastian mines, that the mines are completely worthless. Dagny is furious. On her way to confront Francisco, she remembers the way he used to be. His summer visits were the highlight of her childhood, as they played together and dreamed of taking over their family's businesses. Later, they had become lovers. But the affair ended 10 years ago when Francisco left her. Leaving was torture for him, but he said he had no choice and warned her not to ask any questions. He said that he would do things that soon would make her denounce him, and she has. Over the next few years, Francisco became the most notorious playboy in the world, squandering his fortune on foolishness. Dagny confronts Francisco. She asks him why he deliberately invested in worthless mines and ruined the fortunes of his stockholders, among them James Taggart. She tells him that he should be fighting hardest against the looters of the world. He responds that in fact he's fighting against her and her railroad. She is horrified. She asks him what he's trying to do, and why, but he tells her that she is not ready to hear it. She does not have enough courage yet. Lillian Reardon throws a party to celebrate her wedding anniversary. Hank Reardon agrees to attend out of a sense of duty, though he dreads it. He would rather be working to find a replacement for the recently resigned superintendent of one of his mills. Dagny also attends. Although she feels there is much to celebrate in the progress of the Colorado track, Reardon is unexpectedly cold toward her. The party guests are writers, intellectuals, and other important figures in society. Their conversations suggest the futility of the times. Dr. Pritchett argues that man is nothing but a collection of chemicals, with only instinct as his guide. Bale Fewbank contends that true literature is about suffering and defeat, because it is impossible to be happy. The only thing one can live for is brother love. The intellectuals agree that need is the only valid consideration, that whatever is good for society is right. Francisco d'Anconia enters the party. Reardon asks Lillian to keep Francisco away from him. Jim Taggart pulls d'Anconia aside to confront him about the San Sebastian mines. Francisco responds that he only did what the entire world is now preaching. He hired men not because they were competent, but because they needed the work. He did not work for profit, but took a loss. Everyone criticizes industrialists for their domineering nature, so he simply let his underlings control the venture. Jim is helpless and furious. After some time, Francisco approaches Reardon and tells him that he came to the party simply because he wanted to meet him. He approaches him with such sincerity that Reardon finds himself listening. Francisco's message is mysterious, but Reardon is drawn to it. He asks why Reardon carries so many people, why he's willing to work and let others feed off his energy. Reardon responds that it is because they are weak and that he does not mind the burden. Francisco corrects him and tells him the others are not weak. They have his own guilt as a weapon against him. A woman at the party professes to know the identity of John Galt. She says Galt was a millionaire who discovered Atlantis. Dagny does not believe the story, but Francisco steps in and announces that he does. Dr. Stadler realizes that whether or not Galt relents, Stadler no longer has a place in Washington. To carve out a position of power for himself, he drives to the site of Project X, hoping to seize control of the weapon, but he is too late. Kafimi Iggs has already arrived with the same idea. As they fight over control of the weapon is detonated, and the countryside is destroyed for hundreds of miles in all directions. The Washington men are unnerved and desperate. Dr. Ferris convinces them to try torturing Galt. Dagny hears their decision and telephones Francisco. Just as she is about to leave to meet him, a panicked engineer rushes into her office and tells her that the Taggart Bridge has been destroyed in the Project X disaster. For the first time, she does not try to fix the problem. When she meets Francisco, she solemnly recites Galt's oath to him. She is now on strike. At the State Science Institute, Galt is tortured with a device called Project F, as Dr. Ferris, Wesley Mouch, and Jim Taggart look on. The device runs electrical currents through his body. Dr. Ferris tells him that he will not be allowed to leave the room until he provides a complete outline of the measures he intends to take as economic dictator. Galt endures the torture without speaking. When the machine breaks down, he tells the man operating it how to fix it. The operator realizes in horror what is happening and rushes out of the room. In his overwhelming desperation to see Galt destroyed, Jim finally realizes his true nature as a nihilist, and the knowledge is too much to bear. He screams and collapses. The strikers Dagny, Reardon, Francisco, and Anesk Jold rescue Galt in a dramatic gunfight. They climb aboard Francisco's airplane, which has been waiting outside, and fly toward Colorado. The locomotive of the Comet, eastbound from San Francisco, breaks down in the middle of a desert in Arizona. The conductor informs Eddie Willers that the engineer is working on the problem, but the look of resignation in his eyes implies that nothing can be done. Eddie is angry and frustrated. He had worked relentlessly to restore service. He is bitterly determined to hold on to the railroad and his faith in the world. When the crew and passengers are rescued by a caravan of covered wagons, Eddie refuses to desert the train. With the complete collapse of the looters' way of life, the residents of the valley are finally ready to return to the world and rebuild it according to their beliefs. Dagny opens her eyes and looks into the face of a man, a face that bears no mark of pain or fear or guilt. His name is John Galt, and he had been the pilot of the plane she followed. He is the man Jeff Allen described. He is also the inventor of the motor and the destroyer Dagny has feared. She has injured her ankle. He carries her away from the wreckage. On the way to his house, Dagny discovers that this remote mountain valley is the home of all the vanished industrialists. The banker Midas Mulligan owns the valley. Hugh Axton, the composer Richard Halley, Judge Narragansett, and many others who have disappeared are all living here. Francisco is also, not surprisingly, a member of the community. The industrialists have all built businesses, and the valley is self-sufficient. Galt's motor powers the electricity as well as a special ray screen that hides the valley from the rest of the world. When Galt takes Dagny to see the building where the motor is kept, she reads an inscription above the door. I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine. This is the oath of the valley, and until a person will say it and mean it, he or she cannot live there. At a dinner at Mulligan's home, Galt explains to Dagny that they are all on strike. The only men who have never gone on strike in human history, he tells her, are the men who bear the world on their shoulders. All other laborers have at one point or another presented demands to the world. This, he tells her, is the mind on strike. The next morning, Dagny meets the pirate Ragnardanesk Jold, who lives in the valley. He has come for breakfast with Galt and Francisco, who has not arrived yet. Although many of the strikers live in the valley, others, like Francisco, go back and forth to the looters' world. But every June, all the members of the community spend the month in the valley together. Dagny agrees to stay the month and then decide if she will remain. Although Danesk Jold has created an account for her at Mulligan's bank, she refuses to use the money and instead agrees to work as Galtsmith to earn her keep. Owen Kellogg arrives on Dagny's third day in the valley. He tells her that everyone in the outside world thinks she is dead, including Reardon. The next day Francisco D'Anconia arrives at Galt's home. He has been searching for Dagny's plane for days and is shocked and overjoyed when he sees her. He tells her he loves her and knows she will always love him, even if she belongs to another man. Galt forbids any outside communication, so Dagny cannot get word to Reardon that she is safe. Dagny comes to realize that she is in love with Galt and that he loves her too. He is the man she has always imagined finding. He admits he has watched her from afar for years. Since they are still on opposite sides of the strike, she fears they cannot be together. She also fears Galt will hide his feelings out of concern for Francisco, who still loves her. When Francisco invites her to his home, she turns the question over to Galt, who tells her he wants her to stay with him instead. Galt knows this was a test and that by not descending to self-sacrifice, he has passed. He reminds Dagny that no one stays in the valley under any pretense or emotional shield. In rural Iowa, the government unveils the Thompson Harmonizer, a new superweapon, the result of the mysterious Project X. Although he has known nothing of it, Dr. Robert Stadler finds himself being credited with its creation and coerced to speak at the unveiling event. The weapon uses sound waves to destroy all living things within its radius. Dr. Floyd Ferris convinces him it is necessary to control an increasingly hysterical population. The stunned and horrified audience watches as a farmhouse and some goats are torn to shreds by the machine, but no one comments. Wesley Mouch declares it to be a wonderful instrument of peace. Dagny calls Reardon to tell him she is alive. When she returns to the office, she learns that the government has passed the Railroad Unification Plan. Under it, all the railroads will pool profits and distribute them according to the mileage of track each railroad maintains. Taggart stands to make a huge profit because it owns the most track. Eddie is meeting with Cuffy Meigs, the head of the Unification Board, who is in charge of the new plan. Under his orders, trains are being rerouted and used as favors for influential friends. Jim insists that Dagny appear on a radio show that night to reassure the public that she has not deserted and that the railroads are safe. She refuses. Later, Lillian visits her and tells her that her affair with Reardon will be exposed if she does not go on the air. She agrees to appear. When she speaks on the air, she proudly tells the public about her affair with Reardon and about the blackmail used to force him to sign over the rights to Reardon Metal. When she sees Reardon later that night, he finally confesses his love for her, although he already knows he has lost her to the man she truly loves. Her speech on the radio had been delivered in the past tense. When she tells him that her love's name is John Galt, he is astonished. He suspects where she has been. Jim Taggart is pleased with a deal he has just arranged. Argentina has been declared a people's state, and Donconia copper will be nationalized in less than a month. Knowing this in advance, Taggart transfers his investments from Donconia Copper to a new company, which will control its assets after the nationalization. Aware that he will make a fortune, he feels a vague desire to celebrate. He hopes that his wife, Cheryl, will give him the admiration he seeks, but she is no longer in awe of him, having realized his true nature in the year since their wedding. She has learned the true story of the John Galt line, and suspects some terrible evil in Jim. When he drinks a toast to destroying Francisco, she leaves in disgust. Cheryl goes to see Dagny. She offers an apology for accusing Dagny of being the weak and evil one at Taggart. She knows now it was Dagny who created all the success and Jim who was wrong. Dagny accepts her apology and offers to help Cheryl. She talks about the evil of giving to the undeserving and about the importance of justice, and Cheryl finally feels she is understood. Back at Jim's apartment, Lillian Reardon appears. She has come to ask Jim to use his influence to prevent Reardon from divorcing her, but he cannot help her. In a final attempt to hurt Reardon, she has emotionless sex with Jim. Reardon vanishes, sending Dagny a note that says only, "I have met him. I don't blame you." Without him, the output of the steel industry shrinks. The country is panicky, and violent gangs gain control. Newspapers tell conflicting stories, mostly in the form of denials, but everywhere the collapse of society is obvious. In an attempt to calm the public, the government announces that Mr. Thompson, the head of state, will give a speech on all stations to address the crisis. The date and time are announced repeatedly for a week. At the moment the speech is to begin, the airwaves are taken over, and John Galt addresses the public instead. Galt delivers a long, detailed speech about the state of the nation and the strike of the mind and its reasons. He denounces the mystics who claim God as the highest moral authority, and the socialists, who claim one's neighbors as the highest moral authority. He argues that morality is not an arbitrary system imposed from the outside, but an integral part of man himself. Man's reason, Galt says, is his moral faculty. Serving himself is the highest goal of the moral man. He describes the principles under which every man must live: reason, purpose, and self-esteem. These principles, he declares, imply and require all of man's virtues: rationality, independence, integrity, honesty, justice, productiveness, and pride. He calls for a general strike, asking those with any shred of reason left to withdraw their sanction and stop supporting their own destroyers. He urges people to accept reality and to stop shrinking from knowledge, but accept it and reclaim the concept of an objective reality. After the speech, Mr. Thompson and the other Washington men are terrified and desperate. Dr. Stadler suggests coldly that they should kill Galt. Mr. Thompson thinks that Galt is a man of action, precisely what the nation needs, and that he can get the retired industrialists back. Thompson wants to negotiate with him. After the broadcast, Eddie tells Dagny that he knows John Galt, that for years he has talked to him at the Taggart cafeteria. He wonders if he was helping to save or to destroy the railroad. Dagny asks him to keep his knowledge of Galt's employment secret, because the government is desperate to find him. The country falls deeper into chaos. The government searches for Galt, while a steady flow of broadcasts announce that John Galt will solve the country's problems. Thompson asks Dagny if she knows where to find Galt. He hints that the situation is now desperate. He can no longer control the government's dangerous faction, and if they were to find Galt first, they might kill him. She tells Thompson that she does not know where Galt is. After her conversation with Mr. Thompson, Dagny is so afraid for Galt that she rushes to his apartment. When she reaches him, he tells her that she was followed by government agents, and in a short time they will storm the apartment. He tells her that she must pretend to be against him. If they realize the nature of Galt and Dagny's relationship, They will use her to torture him. When the agents appear to arrest him, she pretends he's her enemy. Copper shortages make repairs impossible for Taggart. Under the unification plan, crucial materials are diverted to businessmen with Washington influence. The problem worsens when, at the precise moment that they were to be nationalized, the mines and properties of Donconia Copper are blown up, and Francisco and his best employees disappear. Reardon's brother Philip asks him for a job, but Reardon refuses, since Philip has no useful skills. He is surprised at Philip's sudden interest. Later, the wet nurse also asks for a job, wanting to finally do something productive. Though Reardon would like to hire him, the laws will not allow it. The wet nurse warns Reardon that the Washington men are working on new restrictions and secretly bringing their own men into the mills. Despite terrible conditions, the farmers of Minnesota have generated a huge wheat crop and need trains to carry it off. Dagny learns that Taggart's cars have been diverted by the corrupt Coffee-Me-Iggs to Louisiana, where they are used to carry soybeans for an experimental project run by the mother of the politician. The cars cannot be rerouted in time, and the wheat crop rots, guaranteeing starvation for many. The farming businesses in Minnesota are all destroyed. The traffic system in the Taggart terminal has short-circuited. While dealing with the emergency, Dagny sees John Galt among the workers. Later, she walks off into the tunnels. He follows, and they make passionate love. Afterwards, he tells her he has been watching her for 10 years from these very tunnels. He warns her not to look for him. If she were to lead the looters to him, he might be killed. Reardon's union steelworkers asked for a raise, but Reardon is never told. The Unification Board rejects their request. Later, the board-controlled newspapers publish stories of the hardship of the steelworkers and the unfair denial of their raise, without mentioning who denied it. Later, Reardon receives notice that his accounts will be attached to pay for phony back taxes. He does nothing, waiting to see what the looters are up to. He receives a phone call from a bureaucrat named Timothy Holloway, who asks him to attend a meeting to straighten everything out. Reardon agrees to attend. Holloway believes Reardon is intractable, based on Philip Reardon's report on his recent visit to his brother. Reardon's family summons him to the house and pleads with him not to disappear. He rejects their apologies and their cries for pity. By asking him to remain, they are asking him to sacrifice himself for them, and this is unforgivable to him. In a pathetic attempt to destroy him, Lillian confesses her infidelity with Jim, but Reardon is beyond caring. When his family points out that he cannot disappear without money, he realizes why the attachment orders were placed. Dagny must cut reins from her schedules as Colorado's economy collapses. No one is able to draw oil from Wyatt's fields, and companies that depended on his oil go out of business. With severe oil shortages and government rationing, much of the country turns to coal. But Andrew Stockton, a maker of coal furnaces who stands to make a fortune, has mysteriously vanished. Lawrence Hammond is gone as well. He had been the last car manufacturer. Ken Danager, of Danager Coal, is one of the few industrialists left. The only Taggart train running on oil is the Taggart Comet, its transcontinental flagship, but all others are running on coal. Taggart is pulling less and less every day, but Jim has acquired a stream of subsidies from Washington that keep Taggart profits at an all-time high. Dagny has intensified her quest to rebuild the motor. She calls Robert Stadler, hoping he can help her find an engineer. When she shows him what she has, he is amazed at the mind that created it. He wonders why such a pure mind would be concerned with such mundane things as motors. He recommends a physicist named Quentin Daniels, a brilliant man who had refused to work at the State Science Institute. The fair share law dictates that Reardon must supply metal to all who ask, but there is no way to meet all the orders. Men with influence manage to acquire much more than their fair share, while legitimate orders go unfilled. The government sends a young man to the mills to work as deputy director of distribution and determine the amounts of orders. The steelworkers call him the wet nurse. Reardon chooses to ignore an order from the State Science Institute for something called Project X. A week later, a man from the institute comes to see Reardon. He tries to convince Reardon to acquiesce, but Reardon refuses. Reardon tells the representative to bring in trucks and steal as much metal as the Institute needs, but he will not help Washington pretend that he is a willing seller. The man seems frightened. He issues some vague threats and leaves. Afterwards, Reardon begins to realize the looters need his sanction, which he must never give. Dagny begins to believe that a destroyer is at work, removing the smartest and most talented industrialists. Nearly every businessman in Colorado is gone. Dagny feels that she must fight this force, whatever it is. She hires Quentin Daniels, the man Stadler recommended, to work at reconstructing the motor. In a furtive meeting, Reardon arranges to sell Ken Danager a larger order of Reardon metal than the law allows. Jim marries Cheryl Brooks at a gala wedding party. Although he does not want to go, Reardon agrees to accompany his wife. Lillian tells Jim her gift is bringing Reardon, because now others will think Reardon is scared of Jim, which will help Jim's reputation. At the wedding, Lillian notices Dagny wearing the Reardon metal bracelet and asks for it back, but Dagny refuses. Lillian vaguely suggests that Dagny may be inviting conjecture by wearing it. When Dagny asks her directly if she means to imply that she and Reardon are having an affair, Lillian denies it. Reardon, standing nearby, demands that she apologize to Dagny. Both women are shocked. After some hesitation, Lillian offers an apology. Reardon once stood by his wife, but now he stands by Dagny. Francisco d'Anconia is also at the party. Upon hearing a remark that money is the root of all evil, and d'Anconia is its typical product, Francisco replies with an astounding dissertation on the true role of money. Money, he says, is the antithesis of evil and in fact represents the greatest good. Francisco tells Reardon that there is no evil except the refusal to think, and that this is precisely the mistake Reardon is making by living as he does. He wants to show Reardon the alternative. Tomorrow morning, he says, the holders of d'Anconia stock will discover that nearly every mine has been destroyed as a result of poor management. d'Anconia stock will collapse. Francisco's comments create a panic in the room, as many guests, especially Jim, will lose huge investments. After the party, Reardon goes to see Dagny and asks her to forgive him for coming with Lillian. He tells her that what he said at Wyatt's house was wrong. Dagny has always known this, and she tells him there is nothing to forgive. Meanwhile, Lillian discovers that Reardon has a mistress, but she does not know who it is. Dr. Floyd Ferris of the State Science Institute comes to see Reardon and tells him that if he will not fill the order for Project X, he will be arrested for his illegal deal with Ken Danager. Reardon refuses, and both Reardon and Danager are indicted. Eddie Willers eats lunch with his worker friend. He worries about Dagny. She knows that Reardon is strong enough to stand trial, but she is afraid for Danager. She thinks he is ready to break and will be taken by the destroyer. He tells the worker Dagny is going to see Danager tomorrow afternoon. When Dagny reaches Danager's office, she is too late. He is with a visitor, and when he finally meets with her, he has already decided to retire. He assures her that even if she had reached him before his last visitor, she would not have been able to prevent his retirement. His only real regret is that he is leaving Reardon behind at such a dangerous time. Francisco comes to see Reardon at his mill. He asks Reardon why he's willing to accept condemnation for his virtues and sanction the actions of his enemies. Francisco tells Reardon his only sin is to agree that his self-interest is wrong. Reardon should have reaped incredible benefits from his invention, but instead he is punished for it. His hard work has only empowered the looters. Francisco asks Reardon what would he say if he saw Atlas holding the weight of the world but losing strength. Reardon asks what Francisco would tell him to do. To shrug, Francisco answers. Reardon begins to think he understands Francisco. Francisco is about to ask Reardon what makes him continue his work, when suddenly an alarm rings and they must rush to fix a broken furnace. They work with skill and speed, each knowing exactly what to do. Afterwards, Reardon asks if Francisco wishes to continue his question. Francisco tells him that he knows now exactly why Reardon remains with his mills. At Thanksgiving dinner with his family, Reardon begins to see them in a new light. He finally confronts his brother Philip, who has sponged off of him for years without respecting him, and tells him he no longer cares what happens to him. He realizes that he has allowed his family to inflict suffering on him by accepting their condemnation. He will no longer offer them his sanction by accepting their moral code over his own. At his trial, Reardon refuses to participate. He offers no defense because he refuses to honor the proceedings or pretend the trial has merit. He declares that he does not recognize the court's right to control the sale of his metal. He explains that he lives for the sake of creation and profit, and that he refuses to apologize for his success. The crowd bursts into applause behind him. The judges are frightened and apologetic. They impose a $5,000 fine on him but suspend the sentence. Francisco comes to Dagny's apartment to try again to convince her to quit, but she cannot give up the railroad. Suddenly, Reardon enters the apartment. He sees Francisco and is furious. Francisco is stunned to see that Dagny is sleeping with Reardon. Reardon remembers Francisco's oath of love to one woman and asks if Dagny is the one. When Francisco says yes, Reardon slaps him. It takes all the self-restraint Francisco can manage not to retaliate, and Reardon realizes how much this man loves him. Francisco concedes that based on what he knows, Reardon is still correct in denouncing him. He leaves the apartment. Dagny receives a letter from Quentin Daniels, who is resigning. Although he will still work on the motor, he will not accept her money, since he does not want the motor to be used by the looters. Dagny calls him and makes him promise to wait for her to come and see him. She calls Eddie and tells him to hold the Comet for her. She will go west to look into the tunnel accident and to find Daniels. Eddie comes to Dagny's apartment to get instructions while she packs. When he sees Reardon's dressing gown in her closet, he is stunned to realize they are lovers and that he has also been in love with Dagny for years. Later, he goes to eat dinner at the Taggart cafeteria with the worker. He tells him that he has always liked his face because it looks like the face of a man who has never known pain or fear or guilt. He tells him Dagny is going to find Quentin Daniels and also tells him about the motor. When he mentions his love for Dagny and his shock at learning about her and Reardon, the worker hurries away. Dagny is shaken by the desolation she passes as she rides west on the Comet. As she steps out of her private car, she sees a conductor removing a hobo from the vestibule. Something in his dignity strikes her, and she invites him in. His name is Jeff Allen, and he used to work for the 20th Century Motor Company. He tells her the story of what happened at the plant when Stearns & Ayres began their disastrous policies. Every 6 months, the workers would come together to vote on each person's needs. If it was decided that anyone was not producing enough, that man was made to work extra unpaid hours. Eventually, all the workers lost their dignity. The honest men were punished, and the rest learned to manipulate the system and hide their abilities. The first man to quit was named John Galt. He swore he would end the absurdity and stop the motor of the world. After the factory closings and failures that followed, Allen and his co-workers began to think he had succeeded, and they coined the phrase "Who is John Galt?" The train stops suddenly. Like many trains lately, it has been deserted by its crew, who simply disappear. Dagny is relieved to find Owen Kellogg on the train, but he is on his way to a month's vacation and will not help, though he does accompany her to a track phone to call for help. On the way, he asks her why she continues to work for the looters even now. He also smokes the mysterious cigarette stamped with a $sign. Dagny continues on to a nearby airstrip, where she rents a plane. When she lands, she learns that Quentin Daniels has just taken off in another plane. Fearing the destroyer has taken him, she takes off and follows them. She crashes in the remote Colorado mountains. The scene in Dagny's apartment illustrates how much Francisco has had to give up to follow his mission and how important it is to him. Not only has he given up on Donconia Copper and allowed his personal reputation to be destroyed, he has given up the only woman he ever loved and betrayed Reardon, a man he loves and respects. The strength required to stay on his course in the face of all he has lost is illustrated in the moment after Reardon slaps him and he does not retaliate, instead acknowledging that Reardon is right to denounce him. Whatever he is accomplishing by withdrawing from the looters' world must be very important indeed. Eddie Willers meets his worker friend at the Taggart cafeteria. He complains about the terrible effect of the directive on the railroad. Competent men are abandoning their posts, and only shiftless vagrants are taking jobs. A friend of Jim's, Clifton Losey, has been hired to replace Dagny. His sole purpose each day is to avoid making decisions. The worker tells Eddie that he will not be coming back the next week because he is going away for a month's vacation. Reardon has moved out of his house and asked his lawyers to pull whatever strings are necessary to obtain a divorce from Lillian with no financial settlement for her. Walking to his apartment one night, he meets a man dressed in dark clothes who calls himself the friend of the friendless and hands Reardon a bar of solid gold. He tells Reardon that the gold is partial repayment for the income taxes he has been paying to a corrupt government, and it represents justice. He has been collecting the taxes of many industrialists for years in order to help them rebuild the world after the looters force it to collapse. When Reardon learns that the man is Ragnardanesque Jold, he is appalled, but moments later lies to police to protect him. Taggart's cross-country comet is stranded in Colorado. Kip Chalmers, an important politician, is on board and demands that the train move ahead. The diesel engine is beyond repair, and the only available replacement is coal burning and cannot enter the long, airless Taggart Tunnel. After a series of communications in which everyone from Jim Taggart to the train's engineer refuses to take responsibility by sending vague directives, Chalmers is finally able to bully the employees into using the coal engine. A drunken engineer agrees to take the comet through the tunnel after the assigned engineer resigns in protest. Everyone on board is killed from the toxic fumes. The last thing they see is the still burning flame of Wyatt's oil fields, Wyatt's torch. Later, an army munitions train slams into the stalled comet and explodes, destroying the tunnel. Francisco visits Dagny at her country lodge. He has come to confess his love and tell her everything. Now that she has quit, he thinks she is ready to join him. He tells her that he is one of the industrialists who have withdrawn from the world. But instead of disappearing like the others, he has stayed and systematically ruined Donconia copper to keep the looters from taking it. She is furious that he could do such dishonor to something he loved so much, but he tells her that it was for the sake of his love that he did what he did. Losing her respect was the hardest part. Dagny begins to see the logic of Francisco's withdrawal and is ready to follow him when the radio broadcasts the news of the tunnel disaster. Instinctively, she rushes back to her job. She restores train service by rerouting onto other railroads' tracks. Her actions are illegal under the directive, but she knows the Unification Board will not stop her, as they now depend on her to fix the problem. She calls Reardon and admits she knows the looters are using her love for her railroad to hold her captive, just as they hold Reardon for his love of his work. By now we know that the worker Eddie dines with in the Taggart cafeteria is a key figure in the story, but still we know nothing about him. In a novel filled with dialogue, he himself has no lines. Everything he says is inferred from Eddie's responses. This curious fact highlights the mystery of who he is and why he's so interested in Eddie's stories. Whoever he is, he knows a great deal about Dagny from his conversations with Eddie. The order for Taggart Rail is the first failure in the history of Reardon Steel. Without the copper, there's nothing Reardon can do, and without the metal, Taggart cannot fix its crumbling mainline track. There are more accidents, and shippers who cannot get goods through go out of business. The economy spirals quickly downward. Colorado has become destitute, and virtually no businesses remain on the Rio Norte line. At a board meeting, Dagny is forced to close the line and use the Reardon metal to repair the worst problems on the main line. A representative from Washington tells Jim that in order to get the permits he needs, he will have to offer Wesley Mouch something. As she leaves the meeting, Dagny finds Francisco D'Anconia waiting for her. He asks her how long she is willing to continue working for people who do not deserve her. She tells him that whatever the cost, she cannot abandon the railroad. Jim Taggart finds himself pulled in different directions by the politicians and looters, and must find something valuable to use to curry favor. The government wants no trouble from Reardon when they announce another new law, so Jim seeks information about Reardon that might help. He asks Lillian Reardon to dinner. She agrees to help. After some investigation, Lillian discovers that Dagny is Reardon's mistress. When she confronts him, Reardon refuses to end the affair, saying he would sooner see Lillian dead. Wesley Mouch, Jim Taggart, Oren Boyle, Dr. Floyd Ferris, Mr. Weatherby, Fred Kinnan, head of the Amalgamated Labor of America, and Mr. Thompson, the head of state, meet to discuss Directive 10-289. This set of laws is designed to freeze the economy in its present state and prevent further decline. Although they fear the public's response, they vote to enact the laws. According to the directive, workers must remain in their present jobs or face prison, and all businesses must remain in operation. All patents and copyrights must be turned over to the government by means of voluntary gift certificates. No new devices, inventions, or products can be produced. Every company is required to produce the same amount of goods as the previous year, no more and no less. Wages and prices are to be frozen, and every citizen is required to spend the same amount of money as in the previous year. All research departments must close except for the State Science Institute. To oversee the law, the Bureau of Economic Planning appoints a unification board, whose rulings are final. Dr. Ferris notes that Hank Reardon will fight them for his patent, but Jim assures Mouch that he can control Reardon in exchange for Mouch's raising his freight rates before the directive freezes all prices.